I'll start with a brief sort of summary of what we think the economic impacts would be of doing different kinds of models. And then from there, I'll talk a little bit about what's already happened and what's sort of the way forward. So broadly speaking, we did a lot of analysis much before the referendum, actually, pretty much when David Cameron made his Bloomberg speech in 2013 was when we started our analysis looking at what are the different impacts on the economy, the UK economy, of leaving the EU. And the kinds of models that we were thinking about then were sort of this broad end of the spectrum, one which was the Norway-style deal, that's what we would immediately get, and the other end of the spectrum was the WTO membership default. So in terms of what we think those numbers would be, is roughly in the order of 1 to 3%. And this is not just our analysis, I'm just putting together all the analysis through all of the various economic think tanks. 1 to 3% is sort of what we see as over the next 10 years, what's going to happen, over the next, 5 years, which is still about 2020. So suppose we leave in 2015, what happens in 2016, what happens till 2020? So that's about 1 to 3%. If you look at a longer horizon, which would be about 15 years, then we expect that this is going to mean about 2 to 8% decline in British GDP. And the reason these numbers are fairly large, so just to put the number in perspective, during the financial crisis, we saw a decline in British GDP of about 7%. So we're talking fairly large numbers. The reason the spectrum is so broad, 2 to 8%, is because many things like reduced trade, we can predict fairly well. We have a certain level of confidence in what our forecasts look like because over time, when we've seen how we've predicted trade flows between countries, we've done that with a fair amount of accuracy. In terms of investments, those numbers are a lot harder to deal with because most economists don't really have a ready formula that tells you that if you have these particular elements in place, that's the level of investment, FDI, you should expect to attract. So those numbers are a lot more there's a lot more uncertainty attached to those numbers, and that's the reason the numbers look as broad as between 2 to 8%. But overwhelmingly, the consensus amongst economists is that Brexit is going to have a negative impact on the UK economy, largely through reduced trade and investment. And most of the analysis will give you numbers in this ballpark, which is 1 to 3% over 5 years, 2 to 8% over 15 years, sorry. So in terms of what has happened already, of course, we know Article 50 has not been invoked yet. So in that sense, it's not as though we're exiting tomorrow or even in 2 years. In terms of what would happen if Article 50 was triggered, we would see potentially tariffs rise if it is whatever WTO membership default. While if it's not a WTO membership default, then we've already heard a lot of the discussion about the Norway-style deal. We'll still see increases in the ability to do business with the European Union, primarily because we are going to start seeing a regulatory divergence with the rest of the European Union. If that's the whole point of the referendum, to take back control over those regulations, then we are going to see some amount of regulatory divergence. We are also going to see things like border checks come into place. VAT declarations will not be consolidated anymore. So all of these administrative burdens would come into play. There's a very, very old study from the 80s, which does look at how much Norwegian exporters pay extra to be able to ship to the European Union. That number is about 8% of the export value. So it doesn't sound huge. I think it's a bit of an underestimate. And it's one study from the 1980s, but that's about all we have. Most people haven't updated these things because we weren't expecting a Brexit at that point. So the next thing moving forward is how do we go from here? What we know that's already happened in the economy, we've already seen uncertainty unleash even in the run-up to the referendum. So if you look at uncertainty indices, typically these are just newspaper articles that somebody's going and searching them for words uncertain together with any kind of economic word like employment, production, so on and so forth. So the one for the UK looks at, I think, The Guardian, The Times, and The Financial Times. And what they find is that uncertainty is at its 19-year high, so higher than when the September 11 attacks happened, higher than when the Scottish referendum happened, and we've already seen what that's translated into in terms of economic activity. So what we end up with is a sort of a recruitment freeze. So there was a survey done which the Independent reported of 340 recruitment companies. 17% of them said they were on a hiring freeze till the referendum happened. So this was a month before the referendum. And another 25% said they had already moved to short-term contracts. They weren't hiring employees on long-term contracts anymore. So we've already seen that the uncertainty sort of manifest itself in real business activity. We also know mergers and acquisitions almost hit a bottom with 70% decline in mergers and acquisitions relative to the previous year. So in that sense, we are going to see an economic downturn, and that's already happening. What that means would be, will we sort of be able to get out of that quickly if we, say, do some kind of amazing deals with Japan, the US, with China, with India? I think it's very unlikely, primarily for the reasons that have already been talked about, that the European Union is a rich, big country in our neighborhood, and we're never going to be able to replace that volume of trade with countries that are far away from us. So just like Canada trades a lot with the United States, the UK trades a lot with Europe, and we're not going to be able to just change that overnight. What we are going to be able to do is negotiate independently of the European Union. And there's a lot of optimism within the Brexit circles about this, that we're going to have these amazing deals with China and India, which are the faster growing nations, and that's why it makes more sense to sort of invest in those trade deals. I think that's actually very flawed thinking for two reasons. One, trade agreements, yes, with China and India, these are countries that do have high tariff barriers relative to other countries. And we can see somewhere in the order of, say, 10 to 14% would be the tariffs there. But they're not going to be very willing to take those tariffs down. And that's the reality of it. Whenever people have tried to do trade deals with China or India, they haven't been rather successful deals, mainly because these countries still want to protect various industries in their own countries. The second reason I think there shouldn't be so much optimism, because if this was a referendum about having a voice in policy making, about having regulations that we can decide on our own, if we think we don't have much of a voice in Europe, which is what most of this debate has been about, then negotiating with countries like the US, we're going to be in a much weaker bargaining position. And that's why it makes more sense to do the deals to try if we can still through the European Union. So the main reason would be that most of these trade agreements are about bilateral market power. The European Union is 6 times bigger than us, and therefore we just need to align with them to be able to get the big concessions we want in terms of regulations or in terms of even potentially access to services trade. How would we move forward? So given that I don't sound terribly enthusiastic about third countries, then we come back to the European Union. How do we kind of go from here? And I think the most sort of sane road at the moment is to try and say we can't push for something like EEA plus right now. We can't even potentially push for just quickly becoming a member of the European Union and of the European Economic Area and getting further concessions. So one thing I think we could propose is a temporary Norway-style deal. Say for the next 5 years, we want to resolve the uncertainty that's been unleashed, and over the short term, let's try and get the European Union to agree on an EEA membership, and then we can take the rest of the time to kind of hammer out what the other potential market access conditions would be. The sort of silver lining, I don't want to end on a really sort of bad note, saying, third-party trade agreements aren't looking that good, and the European Union potentially may not agree to it, having us do a Norway-style deal, even in the short term, though I think there's going to be a lot more room to get that. But the nice thing that has come out is that finally we are having a conversation as a nation about industrial policy. And by industrial policy, I don't mean just manufacturing. It could be services trade as well. We are seeing that sort of come on the national news channels, which was something which has been so totally ignored for the past 30 years in this country. And that's sort of one manifestation of that was the referendum result. So hopefully moving forward, we'll see more domestic activity, at least.
Thank you very much. So if you've got time for just a couple of questions before we move on. Questions? I think you probably... one there.
Yeah, thank you, John Holloway. Michael Gove told me that I was I was sick and tired of experts. I'm just intrigued. Do you have an opinion of actually what happened with the expert opinion and why it was pushed aside in the way that it was?
So 96% is the number as far as agreement. I mean, we're a very fractious profession typically. We love quibbling with each other. We love to hate each other. So for the first time, 96% of the economics profession came together and said, yes, we do believe there will be a cost to the economy. Here are roughly the numbers that we think would be the cost to the economy. We got the same amount of airtime from all the news channels. I mean, the print media was overwhelmingly pro-Brexit. We didn't even sort of manage to convince The Guardian to be sort of more anti-Brexit. The Financial Times was extremely convinced, but that didn't help since only other PhDs read those kinds of newspapers, so that didn't really go down very well. But in terms of sort of BBC taking a fair and balanced approach, and it would be, then what it sounded like was we were having some kind of academic debate, because the way the argument would proceed would be, here's one person telling you something that 1 to 3% of the cost of to the economy. Here's that minority of 4% of people whose economic analysis is fairly sort of, it's very, very weak. It wouldn't get past a published journal, and most of us agree on that as well. And then the 50% of the time would be given to this other side, which would say amazing stories about how China and India were going to give us these great trade deals. So it seemed as though there was no real agreement amongst economists. And when people did go back and do surveys about, do you think this is going to have a cost to the UK economy, the answer was 20% only believed that there would be a cost to the economy. And I think it was largely to do with the fact that we just didn't get enough airtime.
One final question, sorry, just
thank you. Jonathan Webb, Holman Fenwick Willen Solicitors. Ma'am, with respect on the fact that the message didn't get through, you referred to the 8% shrinkage after the credit crunch hit. In 2007, I think you referred earlier that the economy shrunk by 8% or something after...
7% from the financial crisis.
Yeah, financial crisis, okay. So in 2007, the Chancellor of the Exchequer said, presumably with some of the best macroeconomic advice around, no more boom and bust. Where were the economists then predicting that 7%? You have rather gloomily suggested possible 8% moving forward. Do you want to know why people didn't listen? Because the advice was so appallingly wrong in the past.
That's a fair question, but let me have a chance to respond to that. So one main thing to understand here is I completely agree with you. As a profession, we failed when it came to the financial crisis, but that was not the trade economists. That was macroeconomics, which is why we said it with so much caution every time we gave our investment numbers, because we knew that relied on macroeconomic analysis, which we have much less confidence about. Which is why most of the times we didn't even say these numbers about 8% putting in the foreign investments sort of statistics. Most of the times what we stuck to was what we knew really, really well, which is we knew what the impact would be on trade flows, bilateral trade flows, and we knew with great certainty what the impact of immigration has been, even through the financial crisis, that it didn't have any kind of negative impacts on unemployment or wages of UK-born workers. And that's something we know happened during the financial crisis as well.
Thank you very much indeed. So we just...
One more question, please.
Okay, one last final question.
I just wondered if you could focus on the immediate situation in terms of the economy and where we're moving into next year. Do you think we're going to go into recession in 2017?
So short-term impacts are really hard to predict, and typically we've stayed away from that. The Treasury is the only one that did try to do some kind of short-term impact analysis. We do know, at least from the real data that's coming in, that the downturn has already started. So in that sense, is it going to deepen? Is it not? A lot of it is going to depend on as the political situation sort of gets resolved as well. So I don't have a definite answer of how big or how small it would be.
Thank you so much.